listener production. Hello, welcome to this episode of The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. It's a long-held adage that just like opinions, we all have an asshole. So why are we so embarrassed to talk about them? One of Australia's only specialists in anus cancer reckons the stigma and shame that comes with talking about our buttholes means his patients are going years undiagnosed because they don't want to tell their doctor. And in turn, GPs are rushing to prescribe something like hemorrhoid cream for any bum problem, thinking their patients would prefer that to a proper examination of the area. On top of that, general anal hygiene is falling by the wayside because we're too damn shy to talk about it. Professor Richard Hillman says it's time we opened up about our anuses, and he joins me now. Professor, why are you so passionate about getting us to talk about our buttholes?
That's a very good question. Look, it's an area of medicine which is very poorly understood. People often don't talk about it because of all the stigma associated with it. And the people who get problems with their anuses often really have a tough time with the existing healthcare services. They feel reluctant to disclose information to their healthcare providers. So that means that often when they finally do present, they've got really quite advanced disease, which needs fairly complex management plans to sort out. So it is a very underserved population and underserved illness group.
You know, we had a little giggle, but jokes aside, anus cancer is a very real and very serious disease. Tell us how many people it affects each year in Australia, and also what sort of people is it impacting? Is it an age-related illness? Is it affecting a particular group of people? Talk to us about that.
So in the grand scheme of things, cancer of the anus is relatively uncommon in the general population. So we're talking about 500 or so, 600, between 500 and 600 cases per year in Australia. However, if you zoom down to specific populations, it becomes extraordinarily common. So some populations, for example, have rates similar to lung cancer and breast cancer and so forth, but in specifically defined population. That means that for the general population, people aren't generally aware of it, and for the general population, most clinicians aren't aware of it. It doesn't enter into their diagnostic list. However, for example, people living with HIV or people who've been transplanted and have got impaired immunity for other reasons, then it becomes quite a significant cancer. And obviously, these people already have additional morbidities, which make their management even more complex. And one of the great tragedies of this condition is that it often presents late. So in other words, people have often got very advanced disease by the time they finally reach someone like me. And that means treatments are difficult, and the overall mortality rate is about 30% at 5 years. So it has a very significant implication. And those people who do respond to treatment have to live for the rest of their lives with a lot of problems associated with radiotherapies of the pelvis. So it's a terrible condition in terms of prognosis, but it's also a terrible condition to deal with lifelong if you've had the state-of-the-art treatment, because the treatment is so unpleasant.
You've talked about in your opinion piece that I read that diagnoses can be delayed or missed altogether because of the shame and embarrassment people carry around that part of their body. But also some GPs are also like, oh, just use a hemorrhoid cream, like, you know, you're fine, because they also carry some stigma and embarrassment around it. How do we change that?
The reality is for most people going to their GP with, for example, bleeding or a lump, the answer will be hemorrhoids or will be some relatively benign condition. And the GPs, understandably use the most commonly effective treatment. Unfortunately, say for specific demographics, it leads to misdiagnosis. And the other issue we have with anal cancer is actually more common in women than men. And people don't tend to realize that women who, for example, have had cervical disease and abnormal pap are at increased risk. And I think people don't get targeted investigation of their symptoms because busy GP, hemorrhoids are the commonest cause for bleeding. Let's try this and see how we get along. That's how it happens. And obviously patients are reluctant to talk about anal conditions. Everyone gets an itchy bum from time to time. Everyone gets a little bit of bleeding when you open your bowels. But most people don't like talking about it. And that, I think, is a combination of a number of different factors. Bums are associated with defecation, and people don't want to talk about that. And people often don't know how best to manage their anal hygiene, for example. And they're fearful of asking to feel reluctant to disclose that information to their mates. I can't imagine most blokes, for example, sitting in a pub will start talking about their anal hygiene. It's just something that's socially not acceptable in our society.
Yeah, and we will get to that in a minute, but just kind of capping off the discussion about anus cancer, you've asked for state and federal funding for more screening programs. Do you think that's likely? And what else can we do to, I suppose, manage our own risk or be prepared further down the track if it's something that should come up for us?
Look, we do have an application into the federal government for specific funding for a screening program for particularly high-risk populations, and I'm hopeful that that will come through eventually because the science now is incontrovertible. I mean, the evidence is if we diagnose the precancer early, if we treat the precancer early, we can prevent cancer. So in specific targeted groups, anal cancer is an entirely preventable condition. So that's one of the other things that gets me up in the morning is that when I'm presented with someone with a nasty cancer, this is potentially could have been preventable by appropriate public health intervention, like colon cancer, like breast screening. We have effective, proven interventions now which make it much less of an issue. Cervical cancer used to be much more common in the 1980s before the introduction of the cervical screening program. The rates are 3/4 lower than they were in the 1980s, and that's because of the well-funded, well-run cervical screening program. And anal cancer screening in target populations is basically the same as cervical screening. It works on the same principles, it's got the same methodologies involved. So the science is in. What is not in is the resources to go behind, and we're working on that at the moment.
And something else you've talked about as well is the HPV vaccine, which I believe is offered to most Australian school students when they're in year 9. So something we might have had already, but something we could still get at a young age that could help lower our chance of getting anus cancer.
Absolutely. The vaccine is highly effective. As you say, it's typically given to school children in year 8, year 9. If given at that stage, it's almost 100% effective. The problem is that, there's a cohort of people who'd never got it. So people in their 30s and 40s, for example, may have been too old, are currently too old to have been vaccinated at the time. And the evidence that the vaccination helps at that stage is a little bit soft. It may well be worthwhile considering the vaccination, but it's not funded by Medicare, so it costs a few $100s to get yourself vaccinated as an adult, and it depends a little bit on your circumstances whether that would be worthwhile or not, and that needs a conversation with your GP to talk about that. But if it's given to school kids, it'll make me unemployed in 50 years' time, which would be great.
I want to talk about something else you're passionate about, which we touched on before, which is anal hygiene. What does toilet paper have to do with that?
Well, if you look at toilet paper down the microscope, it's like sandpaper, really. So you're basically sandpapering your butt every time you clean yourself. And in addition to being very irritant, it contains preservatives and dyes and colorings and scents and all sorts of things. And the skin of the anus is quite sensitive. And what tends to happen is people get a bit of an itchy bum for whatever reason. And then they become extraordinarily zealous with the hygiene and scrub and scrub and scrub away. And of course, that just makes the whole situation worse. And the more they try and clean it, the more irritated they get. And again, this terrible vicious cycle. And you often get something called lichen sclerosis of the anal canal, which is when the skin becomes really thickened and irritated purely because people have been so obsessive about their anal hygiene. So when I rule the world, what we're going to do, everyone's going to be mandated to have something like a bidet in their bathroom because that allows gentle, simple water washing of the anal canal, of the anal surface, should I say, not the anal canal. Douching's a different issue. And many countries, for example, in Japan, for example, in continental Europe, are very familiar with that and use toilet paper fairly minimally. I think we need to think carefully about what we're putting on our anal area. You wouldn't scrub your face, or you might scrub your face with an abrading thing to get rid of some pimples or whatever it is. But it's a very delicate skin, and you're going to cause yourself a lot of harm by being overzealous. So please, please, please give some thought about using water to remove any material that accumulates there.
Okay. Let's say putting a bidet in isn't an option for whatever reason. How can we better clean ourselves after going to the toilet then?
Okay, so everyone's different, obviously, and we need to be very mindful of people's natural habits are very different. Toilet paper can be used to, remove any obvious fecal material there, and then jump in the shower after you've opened your bowel in the morning. Typically, people open their bowels in the morning. Not everybody does. And then if you just use a small amount of toilet paper to remove the big issues there, then just go in the bathroom and you can do a really thorough clean of your bottom there, just using the shower hose. Very easy. Please don't use shower gels because they can irritate it. Please, please, please do not use wet wipes. Apart from being ecologically disastrous, they also contain preservatives. And I know they're marketed for being very marvelous, but the reality is you're putting more chemicals on your bottom. Leave your bottom alone. Let it live in peace. We didn't evolve. We spent millions of years evolving to deal with water, and that's the best for us still.
Okay. Lastly, before we let you go, Professor, what else can we be doing to keep our bums clean and healthy?
Well, the number one thing I think is your diet, really. I mean, if people have the recommended diet in terms of, fruit and fiber and that sort of stuff, your bowel motions are going to be nice and easy to pass, which means cleaning your bottom is going to be nice and easy. As I say, use water to clean that area. If you develop symptoms such as bleeding or a lump or pain in that area, by all means, get it sorted. Go along to a GP to see what they think and be a little bit pushy, I would say. If your GP doesn't look at your bottom, say, look, I'm not happy with just being given a cream. Or maybe you have tried the cream and if it doesn't work, then you get a bit more pushy. And if that doesn't work, then you get a referral to someone who's an expert in that area. Because you go to a dentist if you have tooth problems, you wouldn't get your GP to necessarily treat that. And I think GPs have got many, many other things to be on top of. And they're often themselves not particularly well trained in anal matters. So I think you get referred to a proctologist and get an expert opinion and then hopefully get reassured. I think in terms of your listenership, anal cancer doesn't really become a problem until you're 45 and beyond. So if you're under the age of 45, then hemorrhoids and fissures and fistulas are much more common. But if you're over 45, particularly if you're living with HIV or if you've got other causes for an immune dysfunction, then I think it's really important you take the risk of anal cancer seriously and get any symptoms looked into very quickly.
Professor Richard Hillman, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, even if maybe it made me squirm a little bit to think about. You said it yourself. It's an important conversation to have. We need to open up more. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sacha. Lovely to be here.
You heard there from Professor Richard Hillman. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is all for now. If you liked this ep or you want to start a conversation about your butthole, why not share it with someone you know who might want to do that as well? Be sure to check us out on socials. We're on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. Search Listener Newsroom if you want to check us out on TikTok and YouTube. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.